Good afternoon and welcome to the City of Edmond's Analysis of Impediments Fair Housing Forum. My name is Megan Brace and I am the project manager at Western Economic Services. Our company does these types of studies across the country for large and small jurisdictions. We've been doing these studies for about the past 30 years and I've been doing these for about the past 5. Today we're going to talk about the analysis of impediments. I'm going to show you some of the data we've been collecting, and this is an opportunity for people to comment or ask questions about what's happening. So as I just mentioned, the intent of this meeting is to review fair housing protections, introduce you to affirmatively furthering fair housing, the rule and how that's changed, show you some of the data and maps that we've collected, and to gather your input. I'd like to emphasize the 2019 Fair Housing Survey. It's available on the city's website. I encourage you to take it. I encourage you to have your friends and your neighbors take it as well. So fair housing protections, these are the groups of people that are protected under federal and state fair housing laws. You're protected by race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, and familial status. Why is Edmond conducting an analysis of impediments? HUD dictates that entitlements must certify that they are affirmatively furthering fair housing in exchange for receiving HUD funds. So that's why we're doing this study. This has changed a little bit over the past 20 years. During those past 20 years, affirmatively furthering fair housing meant preparing an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. With that, you identify barriers to housing choice and you take actions, and then you maintain records of any actions you take to overcome those impediments or those barriers. In 2015, HUD released a different rule that called for jurisdictions to conduct an assessment of fair housing, or an AFH. This had an online tool that jurisdictions could use, and it identified fair housing issues, contributing factors, and then it prioritized goals and actions. So in this AFH, a fair housing issue is a condition that restricts fair housing choice or access to opportunity. A contributing factor contributes to, perpetuates, or increases the severity of those fair housing issues. And then all these culminate into these fair housing goals and actions that are commitments to and must be done for the AFH requirement. But in early 2018, this rule was suspended. And at this point, HUD is encouraging agencies to use these tools and this data, but conducting an analysis of impediments. So that means that we're going back to that old analysis of impediments, but we're using some of these tools and some of these ideas that were developed for the AFH. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Excuse me. So part of what this AI and AFH report includes is an executive summary. We'll talk about the community participation process. Part of that's what we're doing here today, this public fair housing forum. We'll have an assessment of past goals and actions. We'll have fair housing analysis, look at that data, and then we'll have a set of goals and priorities, and then any appendices that we need to support this information. So what's being done? Part of the community participation process is, again, that fair housing survey. We encourage you to take it. The more responses we get, the better. We're up to over 300 responses so far. We have this fair housing forum that we encourage you to comment on. And then once the document is out for public review, we'll have another public review meeting to allow for additional comments. So I talked briefly about those fair housing issues. These are 7 of them that we're going to talk about today. There's segregation analysis. We'll look at the level of segregation in Edmond. We have RCAPs and ECAPs. Those are racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. There are no recaps in Edmond. You have to have at least 50% minority non-white population and at least 40% living in poverty. There are none of those in Edmond, so that's a good thing. We'll also be talking about disparities in access to opportunity. I'll go into more detail of what those opportunity areas are. We'll be looking at disproportionate housing needs, if any groups have housing needs at a higher rate than other groups. We'll be looking at publicly supported housing, and we'll be looking at disability and access. And that seventh piece is fair housing enforcement and outreach. And a big component of that is the survey. So the purpose of today's meeting is we're going to review the socioeconomic update. I'm going to look at some of that data with you, present some of the data about the demographics in the housing market, and we're going to look at those fair housing issues. Again, segregation, those recaps, disparities in access to opportunity, disability and access, and fair housing enforcement. So the population of Edmond, as you see here on this slide, is growing. In 2010, there were a little over 81,000 people in the city. We're up to over 89,000, so we're seeing some significant population growth. We're also seeing a slight change in the demographic, the racial and ethnic makeup of the city. The white proportion of white households has declined slightly. We're seeing a growth in 2 or more race households. We've seen a little growth in Hispanic population and a little growth in the Black population. So we are seeing a growth overall and a little bit change in the racial and ethnic makeup of the city. If we look at households by income, we're also seeing a little bit of a change here. Households making $100,000 or more are increasing as a proportion of the population. In 2010, they accounted for, about a third, and we're up to almost 39% of the population by 2017. All these other income groups are staying the same or declining. So we are seeing this growth at the top, but we're also seeing growth at the bottom. If we look at the poverty rate in 2000, it was 7.2%. By 2017, we're up to 10.2%. The number of people living in poverty has almost doubled. So we are seeing a significant growth in poverty, as well as at that top of the income range like we saw on the last slide. If we look at the housing market, we're not seeing a big change in the housing tenure in the city. 68% of units are owner-occupied, 30% about are renter-occupied, 5 to 6% are vacant. There hasn't been a huge shift in housing tenure in the city recently. So this is our first, this is our first fair housing issue we're going to look at. We're going to look at segregation. So this slide is showing segregation by year. So that kind of gray blue, that's 2000. The middle one, blue, is 2010, and the green is 2017. Anything above that 40 line is considered moderate segregation, and anything above 55 is considered to be high levels of segregation. So if you look here, we see Native Hawaiians and other households both have a moderate to high level of segregation. But if you remember back a few slides, those populations represent a very small proportion of the population. So that might not be very statistically significant in terms of segregation. All these other racial and ethnic minorities, we're seeing low levels of segregation in the city. Again, as I stated earlier, there are no racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty in Edmond. The next few slides, and they talk about disparities in access to opportunity. And there are 7 of these. So we're going to be talking about low poverty. That describes the degree to which households have access to low poverty areas. We're going to be looking at school proficiency. Do households have access to proficient schools in their neighborhoods? Job proximity, labor market engagement. We'll be looking at low transportation costs, what people are paying for transportation, and we'll be looking at transit trips. This is a good indicator of if low-income households are using public transportation. And the 7th piece is environmental health. This uses mainly air quality data to see if neighborhoods have different levels of environmental quality. On this slide, we're looking at these disparities in access to opportunity by racial and ethnic group. So if you see in this low poverty group here, that Black households have a somewhat lower level of access than white households. Black households being this orange bar here and the blue bar being white households. So in this low poverty, you're seeing that Black households have lower levels of access to low poverty areas than other racial and ethnic groups. We're also seeing that a little bit for Hispanic households as well. And then over here at labor market engagement, we're seeing again a little bit lower level of access for Black and Hispanic households than other racial or ethnic groups in the city. All these other indicators, school proficiency, transportation costs, jobs, hazards, they're about the same for racial and ethnic minorities in the city. So these opportunities are physical places, so we can map them in the city and see where people have higher access and lower access. So on this slide, what we're looking at is the low poverty index. These dark blue areas are the highest low poverty index, meaning they have the highest access to low poverty areas, and the yellow being the opposite. So they're the lowest low poverty index, or people are more exposed to poverty. So we see more in central Edmond, we see a higher level of access to poverty. And on the northern and outer edges of the city, a higher access to low poverty areas. We look at job proximity. Not surprisingly, more in central Edmond, we see higher levels of job proximity than outer areas of the city. Again, the dark blue being higher index levels and the yellow being lower index levels. Labor market engagement. This is the degree to which people are engaged in the labor market. In central Edmond, we see these lower yellow colored areas and the darker blue on the outer parts of the city. We have higher level of access of labor market engagement. We look at low transportation costs in the city, lower costs or higher index values in the more central parts of the city, again with that darker blue color. And more on the eastern side of the city, we see that yellow or those low transportation costs, indicating that people are paying higher costs for transportation. Transit trip index. This demonstrates the rate at which people are using public transportation. So in the central part of the city, we're seeing higher rates of public transportation use. Again, on the eastern part of the city, we're seeing lower rates of transit use. When we look at environmental health, we're looking at, again, in the central part of the city, we see the lowest levels of this index, meaning lower environmental health quality. And on the northern and eastern parts of the city, we're seeing higher levels of environmental health. Again, that darker blue color. Another piece of this that we're looking at is the rate at which people can access mortgages. So we're looking here at mortgage denial rates from 2008 to 2017. And we have it broken down by race and ethnicity. If we look at white households, we see that their level of denial is about 7.1% during that time period. So we are seeing a little bit of an elevated level for Black households at about 12.9% and Hispanic households at 11%. Those aren't huge differences between those racial and ethnic groups, but there is some difference that we're seeing by race and ethnicity for mortgage denial rates in the city. We look here, we're looking at the total number of publicly supported housing units for the city and the total number of those that are for persons with disabilities. About 14.4% of those publicly supported housing units in the city are for persons with disabilities. So that might not be sufficient for the population as we see the population growing and potentially aging. We see more significant need for accessible units. On the next few slides, we are going to look at publicly supported housing units. On this slide, we're looking at housing choice vouchers, the green dots being where those vouchers are utilized in the city. So we see most of these vouchers utilized in central Edmond, more in the western part of the city. On this slide, we're looking at low-income housing tax credits, and again, we're seeing that more in that central part of Edmond. The greatest number of those units are used. If we look at other HUD-assisted multifamily units, again, we're seeing those in the more central parts of the city, this time shown with those purple dots. I mentioned in the beginning of this meeting that Fair Housing Survey. We're up to 344 responses, but if you have not taken it yet, we encourage you to take it and have your friends and have your neighbors take it. The more responses we get, the better. Of those 344, a vast majority are renters, accounting for about 261 of the responses we've gotten so far. Just going to show you some of the results that we've been seeing so far. When we asked respondents if they're aware of any impediments to fair housing choice, the top responses were for land use and zoning laws and barriers that limit access to government services. But I also want you to take note that, we're seeing not very many people answer these. 179, 180 out of the 344 aren't answering these questions. That might indicate that we need more outreach and education in the city. If we look here, the Fair Housing Survey again, looking at how these services affect your community, the most highly positive results we're getting are access to proficient schools, access to parks and libraries and other public facilities, and access to good nutrition. The more negative responses that we're seeing that are seen as slightly negative or negative are, let's look over here. This last column here is going to be what we're looking at. Lack of affordable public housing, lack of education about fair housing laws. So those are some of the more negative things that we are seeing in these results. Another part of this is fair housing complaints. Between 2008 and 2018, there have been a total of 33 complaints, most likely to be on the basis of a disability or of race. And these are broken down by issue, those same complaints, the most common being discriminatory terms, conditions, privileges, or services and facilities, and that's followed by discriminatory refusal to rent. So some of our preliminary findings, these are the things that I've been talking about, just say them again. Segregation. There's a moderate to high level of segregation for Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and other race households, but these are a small proportion of the population. And there's low levels of segregation for all other racial and ethnic groups. We have no recaps, none of those racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. Disparities in access to opportunity. There's disparities in access to low poverty areas and labor market engagement for both Black and Hispanic households. Disproportionate housing needs. Black and Hispanic households experience those mortgage denial rates that are higher level than white households. When we look at disability and access, disabled units account for about 14.4% of publicly assisted housing. And in publicly supported housing, there might be some correlation between those location of those publicly supported housing units and some lower levels of access to opportunity. And it might be there's some concentration of these housing units in general as well. So in summary, concentration of lack of access to opportunity. We see those discriminatory terms and conditions, those differences in mortgage denial rates. Few people have addressed those issues in the Fair Housing Survey, and this might indicate a need for outreach and education. So the community input questions that we're asking from all of you. What are barriers that people face in accessing housing? What groups of people have issues accessing housing? And is there something that the city can do to help eliminate barriers to accessing housing? There's a couple questions that were sent in that I'd like to answer as well. One was, do you think that people don't file complaints because of a lack of resources? And I think it's more a lack of education, because there are a lot of resources out there to provide free legal aid if you do have a complaint. I think it's more a barrier that the knowledge and the education isn't there, that people aren't sure where to turn. Second question is, can you define affordable housing? And I'd like to define this in two ways. There's affordable housing with a capital A, and there's affordable housing with lowercase a. Affordable housing with a lowercase a is just housing that's affordable for your household. HUD defines that meaning that you spend 30% or less of your income on housing. And then there's affordable housing with a big A. This is a housing that is publicly supported in some way, usually by deed restricted, where it keeps rents at a certain rate for low to moderate income households that can afford to pay that rent. But this receives some sort of public assistance. So those are the two definitions of affordable housing that I would say. If you do have any comments or questions, you can contact Ms. Susan Miller or Ms. Christy Batterson. On the screen are their emails. They'd be happy to forward on their comments to me, or if they can answer those as well. I appreciate you taking your time to listen to this today, and if you do have questions, we encourage you to reach out. Thank you. Bye.